Just do a little intro about myself. I'm Michael Bogutzki. I'm a chemical engineer from University of Texas at Austin. Go Longhorns! And I've been working in gas separation technologies for, I would call it the oil and gas and chemical industries since about 2012. I've got a long background in hydrogen membranes, basically gas separation equipment for refineries, and have been kind of studying the energy transition over the years, keeping an eye on things. I now work for a company that is kind of focused on developing technologies that are geared towards kind of reducing the overall carbon footprint of the planet and finding alternative technologies to get us off fossil fuels and figure out what that future looks like. So lately, since I guess July of 2022, I've been really studying this stuff. And by studying, I mean reading a lot of reports by the IPCC, the International Energy Association, International Renewable Energy Associations. There's all these global, what do you call them? I guess funds or whatever that's put together to kind of study, what is actually going on out there? What is actually happening with the CO2 in the atmosphere? Is it a bad thing? Why should we change from fossil fuels? And kind of just all the implications of what's going on in the world, and how we can transition away from basically this stuff that basically powers our entire civilization, right? Fossil fuels. So I guess the first thing we should get into to kind of get a good understanding of what the problem is and why it's a problem. I'm sure everyone's heard of the greenhouse effect and global warming, right? So you've got, and if people I'm sure can understand a greenhouse or even a hot car, right? So like just picture you're sitting in your car on a hot summer day, you've got sunlight coming in and it warms up your car. There's no real way for that heat to escape that hot car or that greenhouse. So it kind of just grows and grows and builds, and your car gets hotter and hotter. So the atmosphere, essentially, this is a very dumbed down version, but it'll get the picture across. So the atmosphere essentially is acting like a greenhouse. It's what keeps us warm. The vacuum of space is like 3 degrees Kelvin. That's like 3 degrees above absolute zero. So that would obviously no life can live in that environment. So we're thankful we have an atmosphere. It keeps the planet warm, gets oxygen to all of our cells in our body. I know the folks who are big on cellular respiration and kind of the biology stuff can appreciate that. 21% oxygen, 79% nitrogen, and a mixture of other trace amounts of other gases, argon, some small amounts of helium, water vapor, things like that. So we have an atmosphere that's made up of a bunch of different gases. And what happens is over time, the Earth is basically established as like a delicate equilibrium with all of these gases. They go through what's called a carbon cycle. For carbon, there's a nitrogen cycle, there's a water cycle, there's all these cycles that is in equilibrium with the planet that has been established over billions of years, 4 billion years of the Earth. And so the issue with CO2 and the carbon cycle is this, really simplified here. Basically, we are putting out, whenever you burn something, you create CO2, some carbon monoxide, CO, a little bit of NOx and other like carbon particles and things like that. So, you look at a car tailpipe, that stuff coming off is a consequence of a reaction of fossil fuels burning in the presence of oxygen and producing CO2 and water vapor. What we are doing as a global society is we're burning all of this fossil fuel to produce energy and heat, and in the form of heat. So more or less, we're putting out more oxygen, more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than the natural processes can sequester it. to keep that equilibrium. So we're throwing off the equilibrium in the natural atmosphere, that the natural cycles that the Earth has. So the problem is, okay, so why is that a problem? I guess first, let's get into that. So, first we have to understand how is the Earth warmed through heat from the sun? That's our main energy source, right? How does heat travel through the vacuum of space? Well, it does so through radiation, infrared radiation. There's all kinds of electromagnetic spectrum that can deliver energy through the vacuum of space. But infrared heat basically hits the Earth and it goes to the atmosphere and it reaches the ground, and we warm the planet. It hits the molecules in the upper atmosphere and it warms those as well. So what happens is when you start having too much CO2 or even methane is another molecule that has quite high global warming potential. You basically increase the concentration of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to a level that starts to building up this greenhouse effect. Okay, what is that and how does that happen? So sunlight hits the Earth, warms the Earth. The dark side of the planet at night, right? The Earth would then radiate. It's supposed to radiate that heat out into space to cool off. But if you have CO2 in the atmosphere at higher and higher concentrations, you're essentially like blocking that from escaping into outer space. So you're kind of putting a jacket over the planet, more or less, right? Yeah. And as that jacket gets thicker and thicker, more and more CO2 builds up. Excuse me, more and more methane as well starts to increase. And you'd have to get real into the carbon cycle and how all that works. And that's an entire field of study. But essentially, long story short, putting more CO2 in the atmosphere, the Earth's not cooling off like it's supposed to, and more heat's coming in nonstop, just like that car in the hot parking lot analogy. So that's essentially the problem. And whether, a long time people were debating, is this man-made? Is it natural cycles of the Earth? Is it warming cycles of the sun? Things of that nature. Well, you can actually test this in a gas chamber where you have, atmospheric, an atmospheric chamber, let's call it, and you can shine a light through this chamber with a detector on the other side. And based on the amount of light coming into this chamber, you can tell how much energy is supposed to be picked up on the detector on the other side. And then whatever is not detected, that's how much energy is absorbed by the gas molecules in between, right? As you start to introduce more CO2 into this gas chamber, the heat absorbed by the gases is increased and less energy hits the detector. So it's a fact. This is like an experimental fact. It's not a debate that this happens. It is happening. The question is it man-made or not, which I'm not going to get political about any of this, but that's the main issue, right? So we're throwing off the delicate equilibrium of the Earth's cycles by burning fossil fuels to power our entire civilization. Every time you drive a car, every time you're wearing anything made of polyester, every time you're on the internet, every time you do basically anything except sit around, even the food you eat has a large carbon footprint. And it's kind of what has enabled our planet to reach 8 billion people in population. We have this outstanding energy source in abundance, and it's cheap. So people always want to throw shade at like the fossil fuel industry or the chemical industry and think say like they're evil corporations and stuff, but I'm sure we all drive cars. We've all flown in planes. We're all eating food. By the way, like 50% of the proteins in your body comes through what's called the Haber-Bosch process. And that is done, that's fertilizer production from fossil fuels in order to grow all the crops that feed the entire planet. So we're all intimately intertwined with this energy source. And there's pathways around it, right? So that's the whole issue. How can we get off this stuff?
So before you go on, I do want to
go ahead. Yeah,
give you a
yeah.
little break there. So like you did mention a second ago that you didn't want to get political because obviously people are sensitive to this debate for whatever reason, right? Like people argue whether it's man-made, whether this is a natural phenomenon, the greenhouse effect, this global warming. And I think it's interesting how it has become like a partisan issue, right? Like if this is something that we can test in the laboratory, we can admit that this is happening. We know it's happening, but there are still factions of the population that are saying that it's a conspiracy, right? Like this isn't actually happening whenever we can back it up with proof. And your job actually working for like what you're saying, a lot of these like, fossil fuel companies in a lot of ways, right? Like correct me if I'm wrong, you are working for I don't want to say a fossil fuel company, but you're working for a company that is actually helping with this transition, correct?
Yeah, so you could call it a clean tech or a climate tech company looking for alternative ways that don't throw off this delicate balance, right, and that still allow us to live our daily lives without much change.
Yeah, and that's, I think, an important part is because this has become so politicized lately, you're seeing these like very rapid, very quick pushes for complete elimination of fossil fuels. Where I think
that would kill like 90% of the people on Earth, like within a couple of months.
I think I saw maybe it was California that was trying to implement like a no like ICE car, which ICE is like internal combustion engine cars by like 2025 or something like that, making the full transition to EV. But not a lot of people understand, like what you said, how intimately intertwined all of society is to fossil fuels. And this is something that it's not just like snap your fingers and we're just going to switch over to completely renewable resources. This is something we have to change the entire global infrastructure to support this transition. It's not an overnight thing. And like what you're saying, there are a lot of businesses that potentially aren't going to be able to make that transition. So it's more than just we should do this, like maybe morally, ethically, we should make this transition because obviously, we are warming the earth up and that does have consequences and feedback loops, but it's how do we actually do that? How do we implement that? Is the technology ready for that transition? And I think that's kind of like where we're going next. Like, where is the technology to make this transition?
Right. So there's two kind of basic problems when people think of renewable energy and getting us off fossil fuels, right? So you have what's called like the electrical side, the power side. This is when you plug something into the wall, you're getting electrons coming out of that wall to power your devices, to power your heating and cooling, to power your water pumps, to turn on lights, right? It's part of our daily life. Well, in order for those electrons to get there, what typically happens in the US is you have natural gas coming out of the ground, which has a very high calorific value. You burn that in a natural gas power plant, and you boil water. And when water boils, it expands and becomes very hot gas called steam. That steam is then used to turn a turbine, which using some I guess the electromotive force, if you want to go there, but it basically causes electrons to move in a wire through metal. You create an electric field, basically. And so these turbines are designed to be gigantic, a lot of copper wires involved. These are billion-dollar, let's call it, power plants. And the feedstock to these power plants, the energy source is natural gas or coal or petroleum, different types of basically high energy content molecules that once you combust them, they release a lot of heat. That boils water, that expands, turns a turbine, and sends power to your house and powers the whole planet. So that's the electrification side. Okay, that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is the molecule side. So like I'm wearing probably a 80% cotton, 20% polyester shirt, right? So that polyester, or even this laptop I'm talking to you on, it's made of plastic. The pens we write with, the cars you drive, that is the molecule side. Where are we going to get those molecules if we completely stop oil? Because they all come from oil. They come from chemical plants that refine this oil product that comes out of the ground. They use it to make products and mold and melt into certain different ways. And then you get, your iPhone charger it spits out. So you can't electrify the plastic, right? You can't make a turbine.
Can you explain that process for a second?
Yes.
I'm sure that even myself, a little bit confused as to how something like oil can turn into plastic. Like what is that process, and how are fossil fuels actually involved in making of plastics and polyesters and those types of molecules?
Right. So oil is essentially a bunch of carbon molecules chained together with hydrogens, and you have this kind of soupy product basically that comes out of the ground in vast quantities that is enough for 8 billion people over the next 300 years to use every day, all day, without question. Like, it's an ocean, right? So through some clever processes, you can kind of react these long carbon chains and break them apart and put them together, make single bonds into double bonds into triple bonds. You can add all kinds of molecular shapes on there that kind of give that, you take that soupy oil and you break it down into smaller components. And then with those smaller components, you then build up a different product through reactors. I'm sure we've all driven by a refinery or a chemical plant, and all that stuff that you see out there. Those are giant reactors that are either breaking apart long carbon chains, or they're combining them under certain special reaction conditions to create, just like if you remember chemistry lab or like OChem lab or something like that. They're creating long chain hydrocarbons that have, and when you put them all together, they have certain properties like a plastic. And out comes a bunch of these extruded, like, think of like a hot glue gun. It comes out like a liquid, and then it kind of solidifies. That is kind of a basic process of how to think of how these plastic things are made. And then depending on the chemical composition, or let's just leave it at that, you can get different properties of the different plastics. You have, a Nalgene bottle versus a styrofoam cooler that breaks apart. So those will have different properties, but they're all sourced from petroleum. They're all sourced from fossil fuels because they all have carbon, and that carbon all came from out of the ground. And so that's kind of the way we get products. That's the molecule side of this whole decarbonization thing. If we were to turn off fossil fuels tomorrow, what's the next iPhone going to be made of? What's the next, laptops? What are they going to be made of?
Yeah, and
who knows, right?
Yeah, I think that's an important part, right? Where like everyone agrees that like something has to be done about this issue, right? Like what you just said, like fossil fuels can power the entire Earth's population for the next 300 years, but what happens after that, right? Like, do we just go to another planet, and then do we repeat the cycle and do that and then just add infinitum, or do we potentially solve the problem here and try and figure out a different alternative? So like, that is, I think, the crux of the argument, is that we all understand that eventually, even if someone denies that global warming is a problem, denies that we actually have to solve that, eventually we will run out of fossil fuels. It's just a matter of time. No matter how deep we dig, it's just a matter of time. So like, where do we find that solution? Where do we find that transition? What is the answer to that question that you just posed? Like, what the alternative to the iPhone, the alternative to the way that we're generating electricity now with these gigantic turbines?
Right. So let's first start, I guess, with the electrification side. So I mentioned, we burn fossil fuels to create heat, to boil water, to turn giant turbines to create electricity, right? That's the electrical side. Well, all you essentially need to do is turn that turbine, right? You don't have to boil water and expand it. And that's what wind turbines do. That's what wind power is. So those work, you've got a 5-story tall wind turbine that when the wind blows, it does that same rotation. Basically, you're turning kinetic energy into electric energy by that same turbine principle. Yeah, exactly. So that's one way. Also, solar panels. They take in, that's like a materials thing, but essentially they convert light and heat from the sun into electrical current. There's things called concentrating solar power generators. Is basically you have these things are pretty cool. It's almost like an Eye of Sauron type situation where you've got this like massive tower in the middle of this massive field, and you have all these mirrors that point. They're all kind of tracking the sun, and they point their light at this like Eye of Sauron type thing. But basically, it's like a glowing ball of melted. It's some type of like very heat resistant material, but essentially you're concentrating a whole lot of heat into one point. You can think of like a giant magnifying glass.
Yeah.
When you like burn, something on some wood, you're basically concentrating solar heat into a single point. Well, these things take, 10 acres of sunlight and concentrate it into a single point. That's an insane amount of temperature, and you can boil water with that. And once you can boil water, you can turn steam turbine. So that's another clever way.
Do you want to just quickly touch on nuclear? I know that this is necessarily like where this conversation is going, but nuclear is a really, really, really important energy source potentially. And it's obviously very controversial as well. So do you want to quickly touch on like how nuclear reactions actually produce energy?
Yeah. So long story short, you've got these unstable molecules, uranium, plutonium. These are the radioactive materials, and basically they're unstable. They're undergoing nuclear decay. I'm not too up on the science behind of how all that happens, but essentially just picture you've got this energy source, and all a nuclear facility does is it basically takes that heat energy from these radioactive materials, and they use that to boil water to turn this giant steam turbine. So at some point, you got to have a lot of heat, and you got to turn a giant turbine, or you have a lot of solar panels. That's just kind of how it boils down to. That's like the only ways we know how to make electrons move through wires, and electrons moving through wires is electricity. That is current.
I think the crux of that is you have to turn some type of energy into electrical energy. It doesn't just get made up. Yeah.
So that's electrical, right? Then there's also heat energy. Like you can heat your house. Like what do you do there? Some folks have, a natural gas burner. You're basically literally combusting natural gas, which through that reaction produces a lot of heat. And then you blow that out through your house. It's filtered, right? So you don't die from carbon monoxide poisoning, because that is what byproduct of combustion. But that's a heat energy source. So energy is kind of like almost like a Swiss Army knife of ways to apply it. Like there's things called heat pumps, which Europe uses a lot of, and actually the rest of the world does. And we're trying to transition United States into these heat pumps. But essentially, you're using like small compressors, and you're moving hot air and cold air between a boundary layer to either heat or cool your house. So again, that's a whole field of study too. But there's ways of electrifying heat as well. When you cook food on an electric stove, you see those coils get like red hot. You're putting a whole lot of electrons through a highly resistive material, and the resistance to flow is heat. The resistance to electron flow through that coil is heat, and that's why they glow red hot. That's how the old light bulbs used to work as well. They would push energy through a wire.
Friction? Is that essentially just friction?
Yep, electron friction. You can think of it like that. So that's a heat energy. You also can, you have a gas stove, you light natural gas on fire or propane, and that gives off heat, and you can cook your food that way. So there's these new types of stoves called induction stoves. Those are a little more sexy, let's say, but again, the same principle. It's using electricity to pass current through metals that then create heat through electron resistance, basically. So yeah, there's let's call that this whole discussion so far like the the electricity and like the power side. There's the other side. I mentioned the molecule side, right? Like what are we going to make the next iPhone out of, or what are we going to make your next, shoes? What are the products we use
Everything.
every day.
Everything.
Everything has like a petroleum base when you go all the way down to the fundamental building blocks of it. But there are some really cool ideas out there on how we can continue to do this. A lot of it has to do with kind of a closed loop recycling type scenario, but you can also tap into the Earth's natural carbon cycles, right? Plants take in CO2 and they put out oxygen. And we breathe oxygen, obviously, but the CO2 the plants take in, they use it to build themselves, like to build up, right? Like cellulose. It's a carbon chain. Where does that carbon come from? It comes from the atmosphere. So the cellulose in those plants, and this is where we start getting into what's called renewables and biofuels and things like that. That's the same, well, it's a similar type of carbon source that we could tap into if we had to process it a lot more different than what we've been doing with petroleum, but you'd have to kind of build up the technology. There's a lot of demonstration plants out there on how to do this kind of stuff using like corn or soybean oil feedstocks. And it's more expensive to do this. And here's the other thing, another topic I wanted to touch on, just to give people kind of a sober view of why we use fossil fuels. This stuff comes out of the ground like very near ready to go. Like it's highly energy dense. It's, millions of years of decaying phytoplankton and plant matter that have just, through the Earth's natural carbon cycle, through tectonic plates, through sediment buildup, have just been pushed deep underground and sat there. And we discovered this stuff, found out how energy dense it is. It's a liquid at room temperature. It has a crazy amount of energy associated with it. It can boil that water really easily, and there's an ocean of it. So obviously we're going to use that, right? No one wants to push a plow. They want a tractor. No one wants to walk all the way to work. They want to drive a car. So like people like to point the evil finger at like oil companies and things like that, but it's literally probably the reason you're alive today, and everyone you know as well. Like look at the Earth population before the Industrial Revolution, before we started burning stuff. Like that's what we'd have stayed forever.
Yeah.
So like the population boom is literally on the back of this insane energy source that's so cheap and so readily available and abundant to use. All our infrastructure is built up around using that, around refining that source. And so we've got a lot of momentum in that direction. There's just one little problem. It produces this greenhouse effect that eventually might turn us into the planet Venus if we don't do anything about it, right? Venus is the hottest surface temperature of any planet in the solar system.
Basically on fire.
Because of the greenhouse effect. Its atmosphere does the same thing that we are worried about, in the far, far future. This is not, this might be 100,000 years away if we never stop, but I don't know, who knows? There's actually some interesting proposals on like how quickly we could have a runaway effect and be totally screwed, but
I do think it's important though to mention that we don't have to become planet Venus for things to go downhill really, really quickly, right? So
absolutely.
like what you mentioned, the Earth's carbon cycle and the Earth in general, like it's a very, very, very delicate equilibrium that's been established over billions of years. And 1 degree of global temperature increase is a gigantic downstream effect. Like that's a very, very, very big deal. Not only just, polar caps melting, but there are entire ecosystems that are built up around the temperature being exactly the way it is. Like we've seen already, massive increases in hurricanes just because of warmer water, right? Like these things are gigantically big deals. And we don't have to see, the temperature of the Earth increase to the point where we are melting until that is a big deal. I mean, even 2 or 3 degrees Celsius increase is going to be a really, really, really disastrous thing for the entire world.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you could literally change the way the oceans flow when you suddenly dump all of Greenland ice sheet into the water. And by suddenly, I mean over the next 200 years. We have to, when we talk about timescales here, we need to think geologically. But then we also need to think, I mean, there's some ideas out there. There's a thing called it's got a funny name. It's called the methane clathrate, or the methane gun class rate or something like I can't remember, but the idea is, okay, you get a little bit warmer, then you melt a little bit of the, let's say, Siberian tundra where so much rotting methane has been locked away. By the way, methane's 25 times worse of a greenhouse gas than CO2. So you melt a little bit of that ice, a little bit of methane's released. That increases the insulation factor, let's call it, on the planet, which then heats up the planet a little bit more, which then melts more tundra or these frozen areas where the stuff's supposed to be locked away when we have it in equilibrium temperature, but right now we're in flux. So there's ways it could go very bad very quickly. George Carlin always had a funny line. He's like, the planet's going to be fine. It's the people who are fucked. Well, so like our way of life would like massively change. So that's the scare, right? That's you don't want ecosystem collapse. You don't want to go to the grocery store and all we have to eat is some like chemically produced fertilizer product. And because there's no more fish left in the ocean because it's uninhabitable. Like who's going to create the oxygen? Like most of the oxygen on the planet is from phytoplankton in the ocean.
Right. So like now that we've gotten like the kind of doomsday stuff out of the way, I think it is important to shift more towards like the optimistic viewpoint, right? Like how can we actually start to solve this problem? Like how can we start to sequester some of this carbon out of the atmosphere while simultaneously putting less of it into the atmosphere? How can we kind of reestablish that equilibrium that we've been so dependent on for the last, 100,000 years as a species?
Yep. Yeah. Even burning, you mentioned 100,000 years cooking food, right? Some people say that's what allowed our brain to be the size it is because we access more proteins from using fire and cooking food. So like that's not a fossil source because we're burning a tree, which is part of the natural carbon cycle, which technically is net neutral because a tree grows from the CO2 in the atmosphere. You cut it down, you burn it, you cook your food, that CO2 goes back in the atmosphere, it grows another tree. That's a circular thing. That's okay. It's when you take it out from underground where it's supposed to stay, and then you bring it up into the atmosphere, burn it, and add to that insulation at a rate greater than it can be naturally sequestered. That becomes the buildup. That's the accumulation over time. So now that we've got kind of the basic idea and like what could go wrong and kind of the issues surrounding it, where's the hope here? Why are people thinking we've got a way out of this? And we do. There's pathways out of it. Problem is they're expensive. And then who's going to pay for that? So let's first start with the electricity side. So some very, very encouraging news has been happening in renewable electricity generation. The cost, it's called the levelized cost of electricity, basically takes into account the entire, we call it CapEx and OpEx. CapEx is your capital expenditures, how much it costs to put a giant, let's call it utility scale solar farm to install that. That's going to cost you X hundreds of millions of dollars.
A lot of money.
A lot of money. Then you have the operating expenses of how much, what's the maintenance cost to keep this thing running? How often do you have to change these things out? And so when you combine all that together, you get kind of what's called a levelized cost of electricity. And actually I think in 2021, the levelized cost of electricity from renewable energy sources is now cheaper than fossil fuel sources. That's a huge, huge thing for everyone. Like it's cheaper if you want more electricity capacity. It is now cheaper to go put up a wind farm, a solar farm, a hydro dam. There's other interesting things, but that's now cheaper than building a new coal-fired power plant or a new natural gas plant. Cheaper. That's without any subsidies or anything. That's just purely the economics of the thing. And economics and thermodynamics always guide what happens. Yeah, there's a little bit of, people want to think, everything's so corrupt. It's like, no, it just literally is cheaper. Like the natural gas coming out of the ground is like almost ready to burn. There's a little bit of processing you have to do to it. Whereas, a renewable natural gas, and we can get into that. That's the company that I'm working for. We're looking at ways to purify renewable natural gas from landfills and dairy farm industrial dairy farms, basically, that have like 10,000 head of cattle. That's a lot of shit. That's a lot of methane that's rotting. You can capture that. You can then have a chemically identical methane than what comes out of the ground. And that came from cows, and cows ate grass, and grass got the CO2 from the atmosphere. So you're closing the loop here is the idea. But sorry, I'm kind of getting away from it. But
you're good. You're good.
So the cost of renewables is plummeted. Like it's reduced, like I think 85 to 90% since 2010. It's come down. It is now that cheap. 2010 to 2020 saw 85 to 90% reduction in the cost of renewables, making it cheaper than fossil fuels. So no new fossil fuels, hopefully, or fossil fuel plants for the electricity side would need to be built over time. Granted, there are locations that are fossil fuel rich and very renewable poor, like they don't have a good, I don't know, take Ireland's not going to have very many solar panels, but they've got a lot of offshore wind capabilities. Yeah. So right. There's different places around the globe that are more suitable for one type of renewables than others. Like like if you have a giant river next to you and you dam that, that's a lot of potential energy. So there's locations where this works and where it doesn't. So that's kind of the electricity side. There's lots of hope there to get those electrons into your wall outlet to power, your house. So there's light at the end of that tunnel. The molecule side is a bit more challenging. These are called hard to decarbonize sectors. Basically, what these energy associations started naming these things, but like, for example, let's take an airplane. An airplane has certain properties that allow it to fly, and the energy density of the fuel that is on board that airplane is very high. You have a high energy density, meaning you get a lot of bang for your buck, and the mass that you have to load onto that airplane, the fuel is lighter weight than, say, a battery. I'm sure we're all familiar with how heavy an electric car is compared to a normal car. That's because batteries have less energy density than fossil fuels. It's a fact of thermodynamics. There's no evil corporation making that happen. That it is chemistry. It's physics. It is what it is. So how would you, in a decarbonized world, and this is an example I'm just running down to show a hard to decarbonize sector. So airplanes account for a shit ton of CO2 every time anyone flies. I don't know, there's probably 30,000 planes in the air right now, all burning jet fuel that comes from underground. So you can't electrify those. There's some interesting opportunities there, but you can't have a 500 passenger Boeing 747 flying. Like the size of the airplanes would have to be redesigned. Battery technology would have to make leaps and bounds. These are far away. These things are far away. So there are certain fundamental things that cannot be electrified. You have to still use high energy density things. And so where could that come from? What could we do with that? I mentioned the using like corn ethanol and things like that. There's certain processes out there. A lot of it is under like Department of Energy funding. They're doing demonstration plants. There's a couple of companies out there that are starting to get a lot more attention now that there's a lot more focus and a lot more push from governments to make this happen. To hit net zero by 2050 is essentially what everyone is trying to do, right? To limit the global warming factor. So that's something that, it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of investment and a lot of infrastructure changes and a lot of supply chain changes and a lot of research and development. And so that's coming and it's on the way. There's a light at the end of that tunnel. The other interesting thing is what are called feedstock molecules. Again, we're on the molecule side of these hard to decarbonize sectors, let's call them. So let me just take an example of fertilizer. Okay, I mentioned half the protein in your body likely came from a Haber-Bosch process. The Haber-Bosch process was basically done in the 20s and improved upon subsequently. Maybe it's the 30s. I forget exactly when, but you basically take hydrogen and air. You take the nitrogen in the air, and under special conditions in a high temperature pressure reactor under a catalyst, you can create NH3. NH3 is ammonia. Ammonia is a building block for urea and other nitrates, which basically allows food to grow at the rate it does, allows us to have the breadbasket of America. That's great and all, but that hydrogen comes from where? Where does we don't just have hydrogen. Hydrogen's H2. It's the slipperiest molecule there is. It's the tiniest molecule there is. It's if you had I'm sure we've all heard the hydrogen balloons, like the Hindenburg and stuff.
Yeah.
That it's very lightweight, right? It used to it could like lift and fly you around, but it's also very
combustible,
very combustible and flammable, right? So that hydrogen comes from natural gas, and what that basically is you've got natural gas natural gas is methane. Methane is CH4, 1 carbon, 4 hydrogens. So under, again, special conditions, chemical engineers kind of figured this out a long time ago, or scientists, and then engineers made it happen. You basically split that carbon off of those hydrogens, and you create CO2 plus H2. And the mole ratio is added in there too. So when you produce that hydrogen, your byproduct is CO2. And that is what we currently do for all of the fertilizer production on the planet. We're burning natural gas to create hydrogen, to then combine with air to create ammonia, to create fertilizers so that you and I can eat. I would say, unless you grew the food yourself, like right outside on your back porch or whatever, without any fertilizers at all, that's probably an actual situation where you're not utilizing natural gas to eat, when you trace it all the way back. So how could you electrify that? Like, what could a wind turbine do in order to produce ammonia? Nothing. You need hydrogen. Where can you get hydrogen from? You can split water in what's called electrolysis. And you basically run a current through a solution, and you have an anode and a cathode. It gets difficult, but basically you're splitting H2O into H2 plus O2. And now you've got a feedstock molecule. Now you've got hydrogen. From that hydrogen, you can then build a lot of different chemical compounds that are considered feedstock molecules for everything we use in our daily life. Methanol is a big one. Methanol is CH3OH. There's reactions that combine to make there's a bunch of ways kind of to get to methanol, but methanol is a massive feedstock molecule for all the plastics that we use. That methane comes from underground or byproducts of petroleum. Basically, it always has a fossil fuel starting point, and trying to decarbonize that sector is really where a lot of the R&D is going, and a lot of companies are trying to basically crack that nut there, basically, to try to figure out, how can we feed the entire planet when it's so cheap to just burn natural gas and do it. So the electrolysis thing I mentioned, that takes electricity. Okay, so if you pair the cheap renewable electricity with an electrolyzer, you can create hydrogen. Then you combine the hydrogen with the nitrogen from the atmosphere, and boom, now you've got urea. You've completely decarbonized the fertilizer. Problem is, that's very expensive. It's very inefficient. There's a lot of issues along the way. Not a lot of locations have access to a water source that can be implemented at the scale required. These plants are massive. I don't know if you've driven by. I mean, we're from kind of the Houston area. You've driven by these things. You can drive by a plant for like 2 minutes going 60 miles an hour, and you're still at the same plant. Like, these things are giant facilities. So you have to have insane amounts of resources in order to make this happen, in order to feed everybody. And right now, the easiest way to do that is fossil fuels. And that's how we've evolved over time to be dependent on it. So
yeah,
it's an uphill battle for sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I was gonna say, like, there are, I think, a few things that are interesting to me. And one of them is that you're mentioning things like transportation, right? I think transportation is immediately what all of us think of whenever we think of global warming. We think of carbon footprint, right? We're thinking of cars driving around. We like have pictures in our head of 8-lane traffic jams and, jumbo jets flying through the air. But we don't think about what you're saying, food sources. We don't think about the clothes that we're wearing. We don't think about our electronics and paint. Yeah. We don't think about all of these things. And that just kind of reinforces how dependent we are on fossil fuels at the moment. And one thing that you mentioned too was that the cost of electricity, or cost of renewable electricity, has gone down drastically. And that's awesome, right? Like that's a great thing for everyone involved. But incentives kind of drive everything, right? And if there are companies that are going out to create, let's say, this very low carbon footprint, ammonia or some kind of fertilizer, if that is costing them 10x what it would cost them just to use a fossil fuel to do it, there's no incentive for them to do it. They're trying to make money. Right. They're a company, right? So like that's where you see all of these government subsidies coming in.
Right.
So let's kind of talk about what governments are actually making a push, like what we collectively are doing, maybe as like the US, maybe as the rest of the world, kind of like where that dynamic is currently, maybe where it's going in the future.
Right. So, I mean, you hit the nail on the head there. This stuff is so expensive because there's so much more processing involved in order to get it to the same finished product that we're used to.
Yep.
Whereas the fossil source is just cheap and easy and there's minimal processing. So, so with that basic fundamental foundation of thermodynamically, it's just easier to burn rather than, grow crops and then do this and then do that and then do this and then react that under high temperatures. By the way, where's that temperature and heat coming from? And then finally, boom, now you've got a bio-derived carbon that you can now say, oh, I've got an ecoplastic. It's like, yeah, that's 10x more expensive. So government subsidies are what is going to have to step in. And government subsidies basically they're just tax credits essentially. They are a check that the government writes to a company who satisfies certain conditions of producing. I'll take hydrogen, for example. It's one I'm most familiar with. My background is in hydrogen, and it's there's a lot of hype going around about how hydrogen can be the fuel of the future. There's a lot of thermodynamics and physics that says that is a terrible idea. For certain reasons, and then you start diving into, all right, who's really pushing this as the fuel source of the future? But so hydrogen is a feedstock molecule. I mentioned it's important to produce, but we don't produce enough of it renewably. So the government steps in, and in 2022 they passed the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, and in that act, it passed by one vote. I think Kamala Harris was the tying vote that pushed it into law. So basically the U.S. is going to say anyone who produces renewable hydrogen, and there's a lot of qualifications you have to fulfill in order to qualify for this, we will write you a check for up to $3 per kilogram of hydrogen you produce. And that's called a production tax credit. And if you are a renewable energy company and you say, okay, I build electrolyzers, and remember, electrolyzers split water and produce hydrogen from a renewable energy source or any electricity source. But in order to qualify for these government incentives, your electricity source has to be carbon free or low carbon. Mm-hmm. So you're a startup company and you're building an electrolyzer and you're saying, I'm going to go out and decarbonize fertilizer, okay, based on the stuff I just described. It costs you a shit ton of money to produce your electrolyzer. By the way, economies of scale aren't there, and those will improve over time as more companies do it. So the government spurs incentives to say, I know it's going to cost you a bunch, but what we're going to do is we're going to subsidize you, and we're going to cut you a check at the end of the year for all of the stuff you've produced. And basically write you a check that takes your costs like down 40% maybe. And if you couple that with the plummeting cost of renewable electricity, it is highly, like the models I've been running for my company, like it looks like green hydrogen is what it's called when it's produced from a renewable source. There's different color codes of hydrogen from where they're sourced from. Brown hydrogen, not literally the color brown, but it's a color code. Brown hydrogen's from natural gas, black hydrogen's from coal, etc. So actually, gray hydrogen is from natural gas. There's a whole rainbow of color codes for hydrogen, but essentially you qualify for these things. The government writes you a check and it drops. It makes you a company who is very capital sensitive. You're not in business if you're not making money. You will go out of business. That is how the world works. And by the way, you need financing, and banks don't want to jump in on stuff that's not guaranteed. So the government has to put a law in place in order to spur innovation, financing, start a competition, start a market. And that's what they've done in 2022 with the Inflation Reduction Act for hydrogen. It's basically trying to create a hydrogen economy. And what they hope to do is, I mean, let's be honest where that money's coming from. It's coming from all of us. It's the combined taxpayer dollar, right? So we are all subsidizing more expensive renewable electricity. Renewable hydrogen, let's say. Electricity from renewable sources kind of come down on its own. There's incentives as well, but not to the degree we're seeing here lately, this most recent push. Basically you're cutting the costs of everything. And what the government wants to do is create a market, create companies. They're not literally creating them, but they're setting the stage economically for renewables to compete against these fossil fuels that are thermodynamically and economically cheaper. So the idea behind that is, okay, what are we going to do? Subsidize that forever? We'll bankrupt ourselves, right? No. What we do is we do it for 5 years. And then slowly taper that off as economies of scale have kicked in, as supply chains have adjusted, as more R&D and innovation has come out. And eventually, just as renewable electricity has fallen 85% in cost, so will the renewable molecule production, or renewable hydrogen, let's say, as one idea. That will come down as well. There's all sorts of places where hydrogen can be used in decarbonizing steel manufacturing. So like steel is iron ore, FeO. FeO is rust. Rust cannot be used to build a skyscraper. You have to refine that iron basically to get solid iron and remove that oxygen. There's ways to do that. The way we've been doing it is with, guess what, fossil fuels, and it has a massive carbon footprint, highly energy intensive. We've seen those steel foundries that are, you know, in Terminator 2, the guy's glowing red lava of metal. Like that's how stuff gets done because it's cheap and that's how they do it. Well, there's now ways and innovation coming out on how to do it with hydrogen from a decarbonized source. So there's pathways out there. Concrete's another huge one. Don't even get me started on that. But like literally our entire civilization, like I would say 90% of everything around you has something had to burn to get it there in its form next to you. Either it was delivered by a truck, it was created in, or it's got a coating on it that helps it last longer or keeps stuff from rotting. Even the food you eat has some like food grade ethylene around it to help it from to keep it from rotting, help it last longer on the shelf. Everything has this carbon source. So without government incentives and companies innovating and public sentiment backing and pushing this stuff, it just makes no sense to do anything other than what we've been doing. The problem though is it's going to kill us all one day if we don't do anything about it. So
no,
that's pretty much it.
I think that's awesome. Honestly, like this was a really enlightening conversation for myself, because I know that we had talked about it whenever we had our brief conversation setting this up. But I think that myself, I like to believe that I know what's going on, especially whenever it comes to science research. But obviously, like the details are something that I think most people are pretty ignorant of. And it's really easy to get caught up in what you're seeing in the news, what you're hearing from political figures as like the biggest issues are. And the truth sometimes just kind of gets washed away in that. But like, I do want to use this time as just maybe like a rapid fire question type of thing.
Sure,
just my own curiosities. So you mentioned things like electric batteries. So obviously, I think the biggest company that most people understand is like leading the way with like EVs, like Tesla and things like that.
Yeah.
Tesla is, I would consider, also like a pretty big energy company at this point. Like they do a lot with like batteries and trying to really
mega packs.
They're really, really trying to stretch that.
Maybe one thing I should just really quick mention, something I forgot that's actually very important about renewable electricity. The biggest problem with renewable electricity is the intermittency. Like that means the sun doesn't shine at night and the wind doesn't always blow. And electricity has to go somewhere. You can think of electricity like water flow. If there's an electric current, you have electrons moving. Where are they moving to? Where are they going? You have to be, either you have a demand and you have houses on a grid, or, industry constantly taking these electrons to power stuff, from the producing location. But if there's no take from it, then there's no flow. No flow is no power. So the whole issue with renewables is, how do you solve that intermittency problem? And the biggest thing is storage. I didn't really touch on that. It's like literally the biggest issue. When you are producing excess renewable energy, you can store it. And there's a lot of clever ways to store this stuff, literally thousands of ways to do it. But just battery storage, let's say, is one big one. And that's what reminded me, your initial, I guess the first part of your question got me thinking. Anyways, batteries is like you're basically sending electrons to a large megapack battery. Let's take the Tesla megapacks, and you're creating like a massive capacitor. Actually, technically, it's not a capacitor, but anyways, that is then, once the sun goes down, let's just take that as a simple, once the sun goes down, then that battery starts to flow electricity into your homes or to wherever you're using when it's not being generated by the sun. So that's another massive component to the whole renewable energy problem. Yeah, it's cheaper, but what do you do when the sun's not shining? And that's where things like nuclear can step in. Yeah. That's where things like, you can have a natural gas fired power plant with carbon capture attached to it, although it's pretty poor efficiency. Something like only 20% of the carbon is actually captured. The rest just goes off into the atmosphere, methane leakages, et cetera. It's not great, but there's ways to kind of fill in the gaps where renewables can't do 24/7. And so just kind of one final thought on all of the energy and all of renewable discussion is, it's going to be kind of a Swiss Army knife of solutions. Let's say that, this works well here, and this works well in this time, and this works well in this time, and kind of combined, it's going to try to, get us off this fossil fuel addiction we have. So wanted to get that in before we go too far into the battery thing, but yeah, go ahead with the batteries.
No, yeah, I just to piggyback off that, I actually saw something the other day. I read an article about like gravity batteries, where essentially they convert old mine shafts into gravity batteries to store energy, which I thought was the coolest shit in the world. But yeah, where I was going with that question was basically just like companies that are exciting for you right now, like companies that you see really pushing the envelope forward, really making a lot of progress on like some of these problems. Yeah.
So I think the biggest stuff that I've seen lately, and it might just be the bias of the industry I'm in. There could be a lot of other things, but I'm on the molecule side of this whole thing. And the electrolyzers to me seems to be like from first principles thinking, you need hydrogen and you need a lot of it, and it's got to come from somewhere. And if it's not going to come from natural gas, the next cheapest thing is electrolyzers through electrolysis from renewable energy. And the government just put out this massive production tax credit on them. So I like, there's this company called Bloom Energy, Plug Power, Biotech. If you just Google like electrolyzer companies, they are really gearing up for a big push into hydrogen production, which is, as I mentioned, a feedstock molecule for so many products, like a fundamental building block of basically our entire society. And so there's startups everywhere. I mean, one of my buddies he just did a stint at MIT. He's working over at Chevron now, and he's kind of forming their decarbonization plan based on all the technologies they have. Man, you can spend days talking about all the new energy technologies they're trying to come up with, but the big stuff that's going to be done at scale and at a price, let's say, that is affordable for most folks, because you don't want to cut off fossil fuels and kill half the planet who can't afford a massive solar panel on their house. You just can't do that. The people who are going to suffer are those who can't afford it. So the cost is going to be a huge factor. But to me, the electrolyzer thing, coupled with the plummeting cost of renewable electricity, that's something to keep an eye on as far as innovation that companies are doing. And then, I'm not too deep into all of the weeds, but a good location or a source, if you want to read up more on this stuff, is the IEA. It's the International Energy Association, and they kind of put together a bunch of reports on what needs to be done, how it could be done, and kind of like executive summaries on what's going to happen and what needs to improve. And then from there, you kind of can just use your brain and think, okay, if we have to electrify railroads, okay, who's doing that? Yep. And you can, who's doing electrolyzer production? Who's doing, battery production at scale? Tesla's pretty much the only name in the game there, but there's other folks trying to step in. But I think for me, it starts with reading the actual reports and like cutting out all the bullshit, cutting out all the propaganda, and going to the source of the information, backed by science, backed by studies, and kind of just walking your way through stuff and figuring out what needs to be done, how could it be done, and who is looking at doing that stuff, who owns the patents on these innovative processes. So to me, that's kind of where I would start. And I've done a little bit of that for the company I work with now, just to kind of see where do we need to position ourselves. We do gas processing systems for renewable natural gas. I mentioned, taking methane off of landfills and stuff. The next big push is going to be hydrogen purification, which is, I mentioned, from electrolysis. There's just more efficient ways to use hydrogen than we currently do, because fossil fuels are so cheap for so long, just burn it. Yeah. And now, we've got to get more efficient with that. So, you could spend a whole career, a lifetime, multiple careers. There's entire companies trying to figure all this stuff out.
I'm just trying to figure out what
interesting.
I'm just trying to get investment advice here, man. I'm just trying to get investment advice. No. So next question. I do want to be super sensitive of your time, so I just want to ask.
You're good. You're good.
Next question I would have would be, how dangerous is nuclear? I know that you're not a nuclear expert, but I think that that's something that a lot of people don't understand. Like I'm not a nuclear expert either. I'm at least well read on the topic, but how dangerous is nuclear energy?
Yeah, so we all maybe have seen Chernobyl from HBO, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island. There have been accidents, right? There have been disasters. There have been horrible releases and things like that. Chernobyl being the biggest. Basically, these highly reactive, unstable molecules, basically they're shooting off like heavy particles that are basically, atomic size bullets flying through your body, and they completely destroy your DNA and basically make you non-functional, turn you into a mush of soup or whatever. if you were to sit there,
I think it's important to note too that like the word radiation has a negative connotation, but like
sunlight is radiation.
Yeah, heat is radiation. So like the dangerous kind of radiation is the type that you're talking about, like these heavy, unstable molecules coming from like plutonium, uranium, things like that we use for nuclear fission. So like one thing that I think is very interesting is that like the number of deaths directly attributable to nuclear accidents is like very low.
Right.
But if you look at even like deaths associated with like fossil fuel accidents, say like, oil refineries blowing up, or there being accidents on the coast and, these deep sea oil rigs, you can directly attribute many more deaths to things like, fossil fuels. So like, where do you think that this nuclear is dangerous comes from? Do you think it's just like sensationalism from a few big accidents?
I think nuclear obviously has the potential to let's take the Chernobyl incident. Like you could have, like, let's say one of our power plants melts down. And by the way, these things are designed to be very safe, right?
Yeah.
The next generation nuclear, they're also extremely expensive, but the next generation nuclear plants, they're supposed to be intrinsically safe. So like if all power fails and if all the controls that you're using to keep this reaction stable and the water flowing through it to boil off steam, if it like that stuff is going to be designed to be intrinsically safe. And I think over time they will be, as safe as a toaster oven eventually long term, if the economics innovation continue in that path. But I think the real scare is the potential to we think nuclear bombs, right? The potential is massive, but we've been fortunate so far. Some people have been unfortunate, but I think that's where the scare comes from. I don't think public, maybe public sentiment plays a big factor in why we don't have a lot more, but a lot of it has to do with the economics behind it. They're very expensive to produce. Most of them get like canceled like halfway through the planning phases, and once they start to run the numbers on them, and like all the facilities we have are all, I think, 1970s. Yeah, they're old. So the analogy, I'm not afraid of nuclear. I think anything can be engineered to be made safe with the proper precautions and enough knowledge. You can engineer just about anything. But like, think of how think of how good a car was in the 1970s versus a car right now. Like it's massively better. Like apply that same logic to what we could do today if we had the funding and the backing to go through and make the next generation nuclear power. And a lot of folks are working on this. I just think the potential for massive disaster and then the economics combined with the plummeting cost of renewable electricity all kind of makes like, well, why would I spend $5 billion on this plant when I can spend $250 million and get, most of this electricity I need for literally no meltdown potential
no risk
at all or whatever. Yeah. So I think that all combines. I don't think there's any one reason for anything in life in general, by the way. There's always multiple factors. Yeah.
So how viable is fusion?
Okay. So fusion, I think we've seen, maybe folks have seen recently, like the new breakthrough they had about fusion energy. They finally got a little bit more energy out of the reaction chamber, just the chamber, than what was put in. So it was a net gain. What they left out was
charging lasers.
Yeah. Basically, like it was like the entire output of the United States electricity grid concentrated into like 1 second. They left that out, but I'm not an expert on fusion. I had heard a lot of podcasts about it though. So just real quick, my take on it is, there's an old adage that fusion is always, 30 years away, and due to the difficult nature of fusion, basically you're creating a star in a lab under extreme conditions. And then you're going to also try to extract energy stably out of this thing. I think by the time that becomes a process that is demonstrably repeatable at scale, the cost of renewable electricity, which is what you're trying to replace with fusion energy, the cost of renewable electricity will be so cheap and so much safer and so much more economical at the end of the day, that like if you're a municipality and you need more energy, you're not going to go buy a cold fusion or a fusion plant. You're going to just throw another 40 acres of solar panels right outside your town and throw 5 Tesla megapacks together for 1% of the cost of whatever a fusion plant 30 years from now would be. So yes, it's amazing. It's incredible, but to have it at scale and done on the planet, I think is, again, there's economics driving most of the things that go on in the world.
So when are we going to create a Dyson sphere? When is that on the
Probably never, since we don't see them. We don't see them out in the solar system. So I would assume either we're the first civilization ever to come around to reach this level, or Dyson spheres. Something between now and Dyson spheres is like the great filter kind of keeps that from happening. But
yeah, man, somewhere between the Drake equation and the Fermi paradox. We're somewhere in between. Yeah. But all right, last thing, I promise. So what energy source do you think will be dominant in 100 years? What energy source?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a combination of renewable electricity. We touched on that. And then once you electrify most things, like you can electrify a train, just put a big electric motor in there, and you have massive batteries that are like loaded in by cranes or carts, and those are charged up by the renewable electricity grid. So there's all these like pathways on how to electrify as much stuff as possible. For the hard to decarbonize things like the molecule side, there's also pathways to get to a decarbonized society. But I think the dominant energy source, and it's a trend we're seeing now, and I think it's only going to improve. Like no one's going to be making more fossil fuel power plants in the first world anymore, I don't think. Like there's just no more incentive for that. And it is it is more costly. So to me, renewable electricity, that's wind, solar, hydro. You're going to have a mixture of fission, that's nuclear to fill in the gaps. And then you're going to have battery storage, or there's some cool, you mentioned gravity batteries. There's some unique locations that can pump a lot of water up a hill into like a massive basin. With using renewable energy to pump water up there. And then when the sun goes down, you simply reverse the flow and open the dam and let that come right back down, again, spinning a turbine in reverse and then powering your city. So people are so clever, man. They'll come up with amazing things. But yeah, once you understand like potential energy, kinetic energy, electric energy, and how those relate to each other, you can start to come up with these amazing ideas. And I think people are people are amazing, and the things they can come up with. I tend to have a lot of faith that we can get out of this mess that we've gotten ourselves into. We're a diabetic basically right now, and we need to get healthy, right? And there's ways to do it. Science has shown that every pathway is in fact decarbonizable, if that's the word. It's just going to take time, incentive structures, public pressure, and government incentives. I already said that, but economies of scale, infrastructure change is going to take time before eventually we close the loop and try to get the Earth back to its equilibrium that we are so quickly destabilizing throughout our daily lives, living in our first world country that we do.
No, man, I think that's awesome. That's a great way to wrap it up. I honestly really fucking appreciate this conversation. It's been really educational for me. And that was one of the main reasons why I even wanted to do this podcast, was to sit back, be dumb for a little bit and ask some questions. So yeah, man, before we go, is there anything that you want to plug, like where people can potentially find out more about you, your company, what you guys are researching, what you guys are doing at the moment?
Not really. I don't really have any social medias other than just my personal Instagram and stuff. And I don't really blog about it or anything like that. But I would just say, if folks are interested in this stuff, just Google these international energy associations. They've got just, 150-page PDF documents that's for free for anyone to read. This is what executives are reading when they're deciding what to do with their companies. Like, these people went out and did the research, and they figured out these are the most economical means of getting to X, Y, and Z. And so I would just say, if people are interested, go study what, those papers and those things, like, go actually read why things happen the way they do, and try not to get caught up in all the hype that you hear every day, because, man, there's a lot of it, and a lot of it's bullshit. And it might even take a science background to understand those papers, or to know what that means. And that in itself can be a challenge. But if you really want to know, I just recommend those international energy associations, the IRENA, and then there's a National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, that the U.S. has, Department of Energy as well. People can go in and just start Googling and reading around on what we can do to help the problem. It's not simply buying a Tesla, although I'm a big fan, and yes, we need to decarbonize transportation, but there's a lot more to it. And I hope that's a message that folks take home. Like, just look around you, man. Everything's fossil fuels, and whether malevolent or benevolent, however you put it, like, you're using it, and we're all intimately connected with it. And I appreciate it. It's gotten us to this point, right? We're all probably alive because of it, because of that energy source. But now it's time to change. And if we don't, it's bad news bears.
Fucked.
So we're fucked. Yeah.
All right, man. I appreciate it so much. Thank you. I think that at some point, maybe we should do this again, maybe in a couple of years, and we can review all the things we got wrong.
Yeah, for sure. Exactly. And this is always ever evolving, right? If anyone had a crystal ball, and I wouldn't be doing this. I wouldn't be at work. I'd be on a beach somewhere trading. But
beautiful, man. All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate all the knowledge. And yeah, man, we'll have to do this again.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Bryce.